August 14, 1944. A private villa at Herlingen, a quiet village in the hills above Ulm in southern Germany. A man with a bandaged skull sits at a writing desk by an open window, a pencil in his hand, and a stack of pages in front of him. His left eye is still swollen. He cannot turn his head fully to the right. The doctors have told him that a lesser man would not have survived what happened on the road near Sainte-Foy de Montgomery the month before. 2 enemy fighters had come out of the afternoon sun and raked his open staff car with cannon fire at treetop height. His driver died of the wounds. He himself was thrown from the vehicle with 3 fractures of the skull and a smashed cheekbone. He was expected to die in a French field hospital. He did not. He is Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, once the most famous soldier in the Wehrmacht, and what he is doing in these slow, careful afternoons is writing down what he knows. Papers, letters, dictated notes to his aide, private reflections for his son Manfred. He is reading every situation report he can get from the Western Front. He is following the maps by hand, and what the maps are telling him in the middle of August, 1944, is something he cannot stop turning over in his head. Somewhere in the open fields south of Avranches in Normandy, a new American army has just been turned loose. It has a commander whose name Rommel already knows from the newspapers. It is an army that did not exist a month earlier, and in less than 3 weeks it has torn a hole in the German Western Front so large that the field marshal, sitting at his desk with a pencil and a quiet room, cannot quite accept what he is seeing on the paper. He writes the sentence that would find its way 9 years later into the pages of a book compiled from his private papers. In Tunisia, the Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, he writes, but it brought rich dividends. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces, although we had to wait until the Patton army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. The most astonishing. This from the man who had written the book on mobile warfare himself, whose panzers had cut France in half in 6 weeks in 1940, who had chased the British into the sea at Dunkirk and run the 8th Army ragged across 1,000 miles of desert. Rommel was not a man given to loose praise, and he was not given to false compliments about his enemies. When he wrote that sentence, he meant it in the most literal way. He was watching something he had never seen before. He was watching his own doctrine of movement, his own faith in speed, his own philosophy of the bold stroke, practiced at a scale and a tempo his Wehrmacht could no longer match. The question is why? Why did the Desert Fox, the acknowledged master of mechanized warfare, sit in a convalescent home in 1944 and concede that an American general he had never met had surpassed him in the one art they were both supposed to own? To answer that, we have to go back. Not to the beaches of Normandy, not even to the fight in North Africa, but to a quiet classroom at the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1909, where a 23-year-old cadet named George Smith Patton, Jr. was reading obsessively about every mounted charge, every flanking movement, every breakthrough by cavalry from Alexander the Great forward. This is the story of how an American cavalryman who was born in an era of horses and sabers ended up inventing a form of warfare the Germans themselves could not stop, and of how the Desert Fox, watching from his sickbed, understood what he was looking at before most of the Allied newspapers did. We have to begin with a man who did not look on paper like a revolutionary. George Patton was born in November 1885 in San Gabriel, California, to a family of Virginia military stock. His grandfather had fought for the Confederacy and died of his wounds at Winchester in 1864. His father was a lawyer and a gentleman of means. Young George grew up reading Homer and Xenophon aloud, riding horses every day, and deciding at about the age of 9 that he intended to be a soldier and nothing else. He went to the Virginia Military Institute for a year, then to West Point, where he took 5 years to graduate because he failed mathematics in his first year and was held back. That is not the biography of a prodigy. It is the biography of a stubborn boy who would not be turned aside. The piece of it that matters for our story is what Patton did in his spare time. He studied history, not in the dry way of a man collecting facts, but in the hot way of a man looking for the secret of war. He read Frederick the Great. He read Napoleon's maxims. He read about the Mongol horse armies, He read Caesar in the original Latin because a translation, he thought, was not close enough to the original mind. And above all, he read about cavalry, the meaning of speed, the meaning of the single bold thrust that cuts a line of battle in half before the enemy can react. He studied fencing at the cavalry school at Saumur in France before the First World War. He represented the United States in the modern pentathlon at the Stockholm Olympics in 1912. By the time the American army shipped to France in 1917, Patton was one of the few officers who had been thinking for years about how men on horseback fought and what would happen when horses were replaced by machines. He got his answer in 1917 at Langres, where he was detailed to help organize the first American tank corps. He commanded the first American tank attack in history at Saint-Mihiel in September 1918. He was seriously wounded near the Meuse-Argonne that same month, shot through the thigh, leading his men forward on foot. He spent the rest of the war in a hospital, planning, he later wrote, the war he would fight next time. When the armistice came, most of the American army went home and forgot about tanks for 15 years. Patton did not forget. Through the 1920s and 1930s, while the interwar United States Army cut its budget down to almost nothing and shrank to a force smaller than Portugal's, Patton kept writing, kept publishing, kept arguing in the service journals that the tank was not a curiosity but the future of land warfare. He was, in other words, in the 1930s, one of a small and scattered group of officers across several countries who believed that the next war would be fought and won by armor moving at speed. Heinz Guderian was writing the same thing in Germany. Charles de Gaulle, then a young French colonel, was publishing the same argument in Paris. The three men did not know each other, and their emphasis differed, but they all saw the same picture. Armor is speed. Speed is victory. Hold nothing back. The Germans, under Guderian's influence, got there first in practice. In May 1940, they used panzer columns in exactly the way these three men had all described, and they destroyed the French army in 6 weeks. Erwin Rommel, then a divisional commander, rode at the head of the 7th Panzer Division through Belgium and northern France at a speed that astonished the world. He was sometimes 50 miles ahead of his own headquarters. He seized bridges by bluffing their defenders. He bypassed strong points and let the infantry mop up behind him. By the end of the French campaign, German newspapers were calling him the Ghost Division commander because his own staff often did not know where he was. The Americans watched this and wrote it down. They studied the reports. They understood in theory what had just happened. And then most of them went back to drilling conscripts in the old infantry formations, because the United States had no significant armored force in 1940 and no real plan to build one fast. The man who would build it was Patton, then 54 years old, a major general given charge of the new 2nd Armored Division at Fort Benning, Georgia. He trained his men the way he had been waiting 20 years to train men. He drilled them in speed, in shock, in what he called the holy instinct of keeping the enemy moving backwards. A pint of sweat, he liked to say, will save a gallon of blood. It was not a slogan. It was his entire theory of how to fight a mechanized war. By early 1943, Patton was in Tunisia commanding the 2nd Corps after the American disaster at Kasserine Pass. He took over a shaken force and in a matter of weeks turned it into a functioning combat unit. Rommel was already gone from North Africa by then, flown back to Europe sick and exhausted, but he read the reports of what happened to his Africa Corps after his departure, and he drew his own conclusions about where the Americans were heading. The sentence he would write in Herlingen began in Tunisia. In Tunisia, the Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience. But the Germans were winning. That is the part of the story we cannot skip over. In the summer of 1940, as Patton was still writing staff papers at Fort Myer, the Wehrmacht had destroyed the French army in 6 weeks, chased the British Expeditionary Force into the Channel, and changed the meaning of modern warfare. In 1941, they drove 3,000 miles into the Soviet Union and reached the outskirts of Moscow before the weather and Russian stubbornness turned them back. In 1942, Rommel's Afrika Korps was within 60 miles of Alexandria in Egypt. The Germans thought, reasonably, that they knew things about mobile warfare that no one else on Earth had ever understood. They had their own word for it. Bewegungskrieg. The war of movement. Their soldiers called it something simpler. Blitzkrieg. Lightning war. theirs. The American landings in North Africa in November 1942 were their first real test against the Wehrmacht in the West, and the test went badly. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, a green American force was badly beaten by Rommel's veterans. The United States lost more than 6,000 men in a week and more than 200 tanks. German officers reading the after-action reports concluded that the Americans could not stand up to veteran troops. They referred to the United States Army with a slightly sneering nickname, the Dollar Army. The meaning was clear. The Americans had money. They did not have soldiers. This is the view of the Americans that Rommel carried with him when he was transferred back to Europe in March 1943 to inspect the coastal defences of France. He spent the next 15 months as commander of Army Group B, fortifying what the Germans called the Atlantic Wall against an invasion he knew was coming. He worked obsessively. He walked miles of beach. He ordered the placement of millions of mines, thousands of obstacles, tens of thousands of concrete bunkers. He had no doubt that the Americans would come. He had doubts about how well they would fight when they got there. The Kasserine report was still in his mind. When the invasion came on June 6, 1944, Rommel was not there. He had driven home to Herlingen to celebrate his wife's 50th birthday, an innocent error of timing he would pay for every day of the rest of his life. He raced back to Normandy, and for the next 6 weeks, fought the kind of defensive battle he had always feared he would have to fight, without control of the air, against a force that could outproduce his own, at a rate he could not match. On July 17, as we have already seen, his staff car was caught in the open by Allied fighters near Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery. He was carried unconscious to a French field hospital. By the time he regained full consciousness, a new American army was about to be activated in Normandy, and the last act of Erwin Rommel's long professional life was about to begin, in a room far from the front, at a desk with a pencil and a stack of maps. What he watched unfold between August and October of 1944 is the story we have to examine next. August 1st, 1944. Avranches, at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. The United States Third Army was officially activated at noon. Its commander, Lieutenant General George Patton, had been waiting in England for almost a year in a kind of enforced silence, unable to command troops in combat because of an incident in Sicily the year before, when he had slapped 2 shell-shocked soldiers in a field hospital. That outburst had nearly ended his career. Eisenhower, instead of firing him, had kept him on the shelf, used him as a decoy in the deception plan for the Normandy landings, and finally turned him loose once Operation Cobra had punched a hole in the German line at St. Lo. The army Patton took over was not a polished instrument. It was a scratch force of 4 corps, 13 divisions, and a small tactical air command called the 19th, under Brigadier General Otto Weyland. Most of its soldiers had never fought together before. Most had been in combat only for weeks. The terrain ahead of them in the open country east of Avranches was unfamiliar, and the logistical plan for moving fuel and ammunition to a rapidly advancing army was largely improvised. What Patton did with these pieces in the next 26 days is what Rommel was reading about in his garden at Herlingen. The 4th Armoured Division under Major General John Wood, a tall, outspoken artilleryman who had trained his tankers in exactly the spirit Patton wanted, had already burst through Avranches on July 30 and poured south across the Pontaubault Bridge the following day, before Third Army even became operational. In the first week of August, Wood drove his columns south and east at a pace nothing in the German line could match, bypassing the city of Rennes, which was liberated on August 4 by the 8th Infantry Division, and swinging deep into Brittany. On the 7th of August, Hitler ordered a counterattack at Mortagne that was supposed to cut Patton off from his supply head. The counterattack failed because the 30th Infantry Division under Major General Leland Hobbs stood in the German path at Mortagne and refused to give way, and because Allied air power destroyed the German armour in the open fields as soon as the morning fog lifted. While that battle was still raging, Patton turned the rest of his army east, almost due east, in a motion no army had ever attempted at that speed. On the 8th of August, the 15th Corps took Le Mans. On the 12th, it reached Argentan, the southern jaw of what would be called the Falaise pocket. In that pocket, 2 German armies, the the 7th and the 5th Panzer, were being slowly encircled by Canadians pushing south and Americans pushing north. Patton wanted to close the gap by driving his 15th Corps straight through Argenton into Falaise. The American Army Group commander, Omar Bradley, held him back out of concern that the two Allied forces would collide in the fog. About 100,000 Germans escaped through the narrow opening that remained. 50,000 others were killed or captured. 10,000 lay dead in the pocket itself. The 7th Army, the force that had opposed the Normandy landings, was effectively destroyed. By the 15th of August, Patton's 20th Corps had crossed the Sarthe River. By the 19th, the leading elements of the 3rd Army were on the Seine, 200 miles east of Avranches. The French 2nd Armoured Division under Jacques Leclerc, which had fought with Patton's 15th Corps around Le Mans and Argenton earlier in the month, was transferred to Leonard Guerreau's 5th Corps of the 1st Army on August 20 and sent east to liberate Paris. It reached the city on the 25th of August, and the German garrison surrendered that afternoon. Between the 1st of August and the end of the month, Patton's 3rd Army had advanced farther and faster than any American army had ever moved in the field. On some days, his tank columns covered 60 miles from dawn to dusk, against a retreating enemy who could not reform a line fast enough to hold them. This was the Patton army Rommel was reading about in Herlingen. The reports that reached German headquarters were fragmentary, because German communications in the West were collapsing, but they were consistent. The Americans are already at Le Mans. The Americans are already at Orléans. The Americans have crossed the Seine at 5 places simultaneously. A German officer who was captured that month and interrogated by an Allied intelligence team said something that was recorded in the transcripts and that captures what the Wehrmacht had begun to feel about Patton. "We know he is coming," the officer said. "We do not know from which direction. We do not know when. We only know that our reserves will not arrive before he has already taken the next town." Consider one of the ordinary men who made this speed possible. His name was Harold O. Miller, known as Hal to his squadron mates. He was born in 1924 in the farming town of Galt, California, and raised down the road in Santa Rosa, where he graduated from the local high school in 1942. He was 20 years old when he flew his first combat mission on May 3, 1944, as a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt pilot in the 352nd Fighter Squadron of the 353rd Fighter Group, stationed at Royal Air Force Raiden near Ipswich in England. The Thunderbolt he flew was nicknamed Sniffles. He was the youngest pilot in his squadron. On the morning of July 24, 1944, a week before the 3rd Army would be activated, Hal Miller flew a ground attack mission near the French town of Livarot. He spotted a large open staff car with officers in the back on a country road. He dived on it and fired every gun in his aircraft. His gun camera recorded the attack. He did not know, and would never be told for certain in his lifetime, who was in the car. For months afterward, the hometown newspapers in Santa Rosa would carry headlines calling him the boy who got Rommel. Later research, including work by the archivist Reginald Byron at the Tangmere Military Aviation Museum, would conclude that the most likely pilots to have actually hit Rommel's car at Sainte-Foy de Montgomery on July 17 were Charlie Fox of No. 412 Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force, with a second possibility being South African Johannes Leroux of the Royal Air Force. Miller had strafed a different staff car on a different day, but it does not matter who got Rommel, exactly, because by mid-August 1944 there were hundreds of pilots like Hal Miller in the skies over France, men in their early 20s who had learned to fly 2 years earlier, who now owned the daylight hours over every German road between the Seine and the Saar. This is one of the reasons Patton could move as fast as he did. He had the sky. The men of the Red Ball Express were the other reason. If you are watching this and your father or uncle drove a truck for the Quartermaster Corps in France in the autumn of 1944, I would be honored to read his name in the comments. He was part of something the American military had never attempted before, and something the Germans, even at their best, could not have matched. It is worth pausing for a moment to remember him. The young men in the cabs of those jimmies, about 75% of them, African-American soldiers in a still segregated army, kept Patton's tanks rolling on nothing but cold coffee, cigarettes, and sheer force of will. A like on this video, a second of attention, is a small way to keep the memory of what they did from slipping any further into silence. And now I want to turn to the piece of the campaign that Rommel, in his Herlingen garden in September, was probably reading about with the sharpest professional attention of his life, because what he had been watching in August was speed against a broken enemy. What he watched in September was speed against his own reinforcements. On the 12th of September, 1944, Patton's Third Army reached the Moselle River in Lorraine. It had been a campaign of 6 weeks. The Americans were tired. Their tanks were worn. The Red Ball Express had kept them moving, but the logistics strain was beginning to tell. On the 30th of August, Patton's daily gasoline receipts collapsed from roughly 400,000 gallons to about 32,000, a drop of better than 90%, because Eisenhower had shifted supply priority to the northern armies for the operation that would become Market Garden. "My men can eat their belts," Patton told Eisenhower at a meeting on September 2, "but my tanks have got to have gas." It was not a joke. It was a factual description of the Third Army's situation. Patton had outrun his own supply lines and was now sitting on the Moselle, facing the last major natural barrier before the German border, with a dwindling ability to move. Hitler, watching from East Prussia, believed he saw an opportunity. He ordered the newly rebuilt 5th Panzer Army, under the command of General Hasso von Manteuffel, to launch a counterattack in Lorraine, aimed at recapturing the town of Luneville and the American bridgehead over the Moselle at Dieulouard. The force he assembled was the strongest German armored concentration in the West since D-Day. 262 tanks and assault guns, 2 fresh panzer brigades, the 111th and the 113th, equipped with brand-new Mark V Panther tanks straight from the factory, elements of the 11th Panzer Division, a veteran formation, supporting infantry and artillery. On paper, it was a force that could smash a single American armored division, which was precisely what it was going to meet in the open country around the village of Arracourt. What happened there between the 19th and the 29th of September 1944 was the largest tank battle fought by the United States Army on the Western Front to that date. The American formation in the Germans' path was Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division under Colonel Bruce Clark, a tough engineer turned tanker who had been one of Wood's trusted subordinates since Normandy. Clark had about 50 M4 Sherman medium tanks, a handful of M5 light tanks, and the M18 Hellcat tank destroyers of the 704th Battalion. He was outnumbered roughly 3-1 in armor, and the German Panthers mounted a 75mm gun with a much longer effective range than Clark's Shermans. The morning of the 19th broke with a heavy ground fog. The Germans attacked blind. Because the 5th Panzer Army had been rebuilt so hastily, its reconnaissance units were inadequate, and its new crews had never trained together in combined arms operations. They drove straight into Clark's positions without knowing where Clark's positions were. The Shermans, firing from concealment, caught the Panthers in the flank at ranges of 400 yards or less. At that distance, the Sherman's 75mm gun could kill a Panther by punching through its thinner side armor. 11 German tanks burned in the first exchange. By the end of the morning, the advance of the 113th Panzer Brigade had been stopped. It was not a single engagement, but 11 days of running combat. The Germans kept coming. Clark's men, along with the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a short gravel-voiced tanker born in Springfield, Massachusetts, and raised in the Feeding Hills section of nearby Agawam, who chewed a cigar and led from his command tank, kept finding ways to defeat them. They used the fog, when it came, to close with the Panthers at ranges where Sherman guns worked. They used the terrain, low-rolling farmland with small woods and folds of ground, to hide from Panther guns until the Panthers came to them. They used the 19th Tactical Air Command, the Thunderbolts under Wayland, to hunt German columns on the roads whenever the weather cleared. By the 29th of September, the 5th Panzer Army had lost roughly 200 of its 262 tanks and assault guns. The 4th Armored Division had lost about 48 tanks, total. On the 30th, the German counter-offensive in Lorraine was called off. Patton said of Abrams, in a line that Louis Sawley would later preserve in his biography Thunderbolt, words that would enter Army folklore. "I am supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army," he said. But I have one peer, Abe Abrams. He is the world champion. Abrams would win the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Arracourt on September 20th, and would win a second at Assenoir 3 months later. He would end the war a full colonel. He would become Army Chief of Staff in 1972, and the Army's main battle tank, the M1, would be named the Abrams after him when it entered service in 1980. But in September 1944, he was a 30-year-old lieutenant colonel fighting in a fog with worn tanks against a force that was supposed to overrun him, and instead he broke it. This is the kind of small unit improvisation that Rommel, reading his situation reports in Herlingen, was no longer able to produce in his own army, no matter how hard he tried. Why not? The answer has almost nothing to do with equipment or tactical talent, because by any fair measure the Wehrmacht still had both of those things in the autumn of 1944. The Panther tank was a better tank than the Sherman. German tank crews, man for man, were probably more experienced than American crews. German junior officers were still trained in the doctrine of independent initiative that their army had been teaching since the 1860s. The problem was not the Wehrmacht on paper. The problem was what the Wehrmacht had become. By the time Patton's Third Army was racing across France, 3 years of war on the Eastern Front had eaten the heart out of the German officer corps. Between the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 and the late summer of 1944, the Wehrmacht had suffered on the order of 2.5 million dead and missing in Russia, with Operation Bagration alone costing several 100,000 in the single month of August. The men who die first in any army are the junior officers and the senior sergeants who lead from the front. The doctrine of Auftragstaktik, of mission tactics, requires those men. It cannot function without a deep bench of captains and lieutenants who have been trained for years in the habit of making their own decisions. Germany, by 1944, no longer had that bench. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades at Arracourt were brand new formations. Their crews had never trained together. Their officers had come from depots and rear area schools. They had the Panthers, but they did not have the soldiers to get the most out of them. The Americans had the opposite problem, which turned out to be a strength. The American Officer Corps in the spring of 1943 had been almost embarrassingly thin. The pre-war regular army of the United States had numbered less than 200,000 men total. Almost every American division that fought in Europe had been raised from scratch in the previous 3 years. Its officers and sergeants had been commissioned and promoted at a speed that would have horrified a Prussian in peacetime, but that speed turned out to be a gift. The Third Army's junior officers in Lorraine were young men in their 20s and early 30s who had come through a rapidly built training pipeline without 20 years of peacetime habit to unlearn. They did what they were told to do, and when what they were told stopped matching the situation, they improvised. There was also the American civilian background. Many of Patton's tankers had grown up fixing their own trucks and tractors on farms in Iowa and Texas and Pennsylvania, reading automobile magazines as boys, taking apart engines in their own driveways. When a Sherman threw a track in a Lorraine cornfield, the crew generally fixed it in the field without waiting for a maintenance battalion. The famous Rhino hedgerow cutters that Sergeant Curtis Cullen Jr. had welded onto Shermans in Normandy 6 weeks earlier were part of the same phenomenon. Americans improvised with metal because they had been improvising with metal since childhood. It was not a doctrine. It was a habit. And it was a habit the Germans could not replicate by decree. And there was Patton himself. He was 58 years old in the summer of 1944. He had been studying armored warfare, reading, writing, and arguing about it, since before many of his own men were born. He had a clear operational philosophy that he could explain in 2 sentences to any officer in his command. Find the enemy, hit him where he is not. He ran his headquarters like a school. He pushed his corps commanders to push their division, commanders to push their regiments, to push their battalions, to push their companies. He believed with an almost religious intensity that a moving column was safer than a stationary one, because the enemy could not shoot what he could not find. This is exactly what Rommel had believed in the desert. Patton had absorbed it from watching Rommel from across the sand in 1943, and he was now practicing it at a scale Rommel had never been given the resources to try. Rommel understood this. He had spent his whole career in an army that believed what Patton believed. In his final weeks, in Herlingen, as the Gestapo began to close in on him because of his peripheral connection to the July 20th plot against Hitler, he also understood something else. The Wehrmacht that had trained him to fight this way no longer existed. Hitler had spent 2 years micromanaging the army from the Wolfschans, firing any general who exercised independent judgment, requiring permission for withdrawals at the battalion level, punishing initiative as insubordination. The doctrine was still in the manual. The men had forgotten how to use it. Rommel had argued against this tendency since 1942. He had written it in reports. He had said it to Hitler's face. It had cost him his command and, by October of 1944, it would cost him his life. But there is one moment in the story of Patton and his Third Army where the contrast between the two armies came into the clearest possible focus, and it came after Rommel was already gone. Rommel took cyanide on October 14th, 1944, in the back seat of a staff car on a country lane outside Herlingen, after 2 emissaries from Berlin, Generals Bergdorf and Maisel, arrived at his door with Hitler's ultimatum. The choice was suicide, with a state funeral and his family left alone, or a public trial before a people's court that would end in execution and the ruin of his wife and son. He was 52 years old. He did not live to see what Patton would do in the snow 2 months later. But the moment is the final test of the argument he had already made about the Patton army in France. On December 16, 1944, before dawn, roughly 20 German divisions and about 200,000 men, supported by something like 1,000 tanks and assault guns, attacked the thinly held American line in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. Over the coming weeks, the German commitment would rise to more than 400,000, but the opening blow was large enough. The attack achieved almost complete surprise. By December 20th, the German spearheads had surrounded the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division under its acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was holding on without winter clothing, without adequate ammunition, and for most of the siege without air resupply because of fog. On December 22nd, 4 German soldiers walked up to the American perimeter under a white flag carrying a written ultimatum demanding the honorable surrender of Bastogne within 2 hours. McAuliffe, handed the note by a subordinate, read it, said, "Oh nuts," more or less to himself, and asked his staff what he should reply. Someone suggested that his first reaction had been good enough. McAuliffe wrote on a sheet of paper to the German commander, "Nuts," the American commander. The German officers who received the reply did not understand the word and had to have it translated. That moment has passed into American folklore, and rightly, but what happened behind the scenes of the Bastogne relief is the piece that belongs most properly in Rommel's sentence about the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. Patton had been told of the German breakthrough on December 17th. At that moment, his Third Army was in the Saar region of western Germany, attacking due east toward the Rhine. On December 18th, he received orders from Bradley to transfer the 10th Armoured Division to the First Army and to prepare to turn part of his own army 90 degrees, from east-facing to north-facing, to strike the southern flank of the German salient. On December 19th, at a meeting in Verdun chaired by Eisenhower himself, Patton told the assembled senior Allied commanders that he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room fell silent. Bradley told him that was impossible. Patton said it was not. What the generals in the room did not know was that Patton had already given his staff 3 contingency plans for a northward pivot, keyed to prearranged code phrases, before he had ever left his own headquarters. When word came back that Eisenhower had approved the maneuver, Patton made a single telephone call that set the whole machinery in motion. Over the next 6 days, the Third Army executed what military staff colleges still teach as one of the great logistical achievements in the history of mechanized warfare. 3 divisions, something on the order of 100,000 men and more than 130,000 vehicles, disengaged from a major offensive action, turned 90 degrees, and attacked in a new direction over congested icy roads in winter conditions within the window Patton had promised. The spearhead of the movement was the 4th Armoured Division, the same division that had broken out at Avranches in August and destroyed the Panzer brigades at Arracourt in September. Its lead battalion was Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, the same battalion that had fought at Arracourt. On the afternoon of December 26, at about 4:50, a single Sherman tank named Cobra King, under the command of First Lieutenant Charles Boggess of Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, broke through the German encirclement near the village of Astonishing and made contact with the engineers of the 101st Airborne on the southern edge of Bastogne. The siege was broken. Abrams rolled in behind him in his own command tank, Thunderbolt the 6th, and linked up with Brigadier General McAuliffe a few minutes past 5. He had, in the course of that single week, led his battalion in a 150-mile march north in freezing weather, fought through the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, destroyed hidden German anti-tank guns in face-to-face combat, and delivered an American armored division into a surrounded American airborne division in the middle of a blizzard. Rommel had been dead for 2 months when Abrams reached Bastogne. He never saw the Ardennes, but the relief of Bastogne is the clearest possible demonstration of what he had been writing about in August when he used the word astonishing. The Third Army had done, in 6 days in the snow, something no army in Europe had ever done before. It had pivoted a major formation 90 degrees on no notice, in winter weather, and it had completed the move within the time its commander had promised. The men who had done it were the same men who had broken out at Avranches and stopped the Panthers at Arracourt. They were a force that by December of 1944 had become, in the strict military sense, a fully mature instrument of the kind of war Rommel and Patton had both been studying for 30 years. One more piece of evidence is worth considering, because it comes from a source Rommel never touched but which historians have since examined with great care. Throughout the war, British military intelligence recorded the private conversations of captured senior German officers held at a country house north of London, called Trent Park. The generals who lived there thought they were simply talking among themselves, between chess games and walks in the garden. They were not. Every room was wired, and the transcribers, many of them German Jewish refugees who had fled the Reich a few years earlier, listened in shifts and took down every word. The resulting files, published in edited form by the historian Sonke Neitzel under the title Tapping Hitler's Generals, run to many tens of thousands of pages. What stands out in the Trent Park transcripts from late 1944 and early 1945 is how often captured German officers, talking freely to each other, returned to the subject of the American army in France with something close to professional bewilderment. They knew from their own reports that the Americans at Kasserine had been easy. They could not reconcile that memory with what they had met in Normandy and Lorraine. One general, captured in Italy and later transferred to Trent Park, told a fellow prisoner that the American tempo in Lorraine had been faster than anything German reconnaissance could track in real time. Another, discussing the Ardennes, told a companion that the German counteroffensive had already failed by the 4th day because the weather had lifted and the American tactical air was back in the sky. A third, reflecting on the whole Western campaign, said in essence what Alfred Jodl would later say at Nuremberg under interrogation, that the war in the West had been effectively lost at the moment of the Normandy breakout. That is, at the moment Third Army was activated and turned loose. Rommel did not live to read these transcripts, but his sentence in the Rommel papers captures what they say. The Patton army in France was the most astonishing thing he had seen in 40 years of studying war, and he had the honesty to write it down in a book that would be published only after his death by an English editor he had never met. Working from papers, his widow had kept safely locked in a drawer in Herlingen through the last months of the war. So what did Rommel see? He saw an American general who had studied the same campaigns he had studied and had reached the same conclusions about mobility, deception, and the bold stroke, but who was working with a country, a logistical depth, and a pool of young junior officers Rommel had never been given. He saw the Wehrmacht's own doctrine being practiced, with a fluency the Wehrmacht itself had lost, by men who had never read a German staff manual, and he saw it without looking away, which is the hardest thing for a professional soldier to do when the men he is watching are the men who will win. That is why the sentence he wrote in Herlingen, in the last month of his life, matters. It was not chivalry between old adversaries, it was a judgment. The most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare, written by a man who had once been the most famous mobile commander on earth, about an enemy he would never face in the field, George Patton outlived Rommel by about 14 months. He was killed not in battle but in an automobile accident near Mannheim in December 1945, 7 months after the German surrender. Creighton Abrams lived to become one of the most respected officers in the post-war American Army. The men of the 4th Armored Division who had fought at Avranches and Arracourt and Bastogne went home, mostly to quiet lives. Hal Miller came back to Santa Rosa and worked in business. The truck drivers of the Red Bull Express, most of them black Americans in a segregated army that had given them the hardest and least glamorous jobs of the war, returned to a country that was not yet ready to give them credit for what they had done. Many of them never got that credit in their lifetimes. If any member of your family drove for the Red Bull, fought in the 4th Armored, flew a Thunderbolt over France, or walked into Bastogne in the last days of December 1944, I would count it a privilege to hear about him in the comments. What was his name? What did he remember? What did he tell you that he did not tell the newspapers? Those small private facts are the part of the history that the books cannot reach. If this investigation gave you something to think about, consider subscribing so the next one can find you. There are many of these stories, and most of them turn, in the end, on ordinary men making extraordinary decisions in moments nobody warned them were coming. And the last word belongs to the man at the desk in Herlingen. He had spent his life believing that speed was the highest virtue in war, and that the soldier who hesitated was already beaten. In August 1944, sitting in a shaded garden with his papers and his pencil, he watched an American army practice his own creed at a scale he could not match, and he did what every honest professional eventually does. He put down what he saw, in plain words, and he signed his name to it. He never wrote a more generous sentence about anyone, and he never wrote a more truthful one either.